step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
In July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin made history by being the first human beings to walk around on the surface of the moon. 55 years have passed since their accomplishment, and since then, it's become somewhat of a point of contention. According to a poll of a representative sample of the U.S. public in 2019, 5% of Americans are strongly skeptical about the moon landing, 6% slightly doubt the story, and another 18% either don't know what to think or can't decide. I studied aerospace engineering and public administration in college, and I learned a lot about the scientific principles that enabled NASA to stuff 3 people into a tin can, hitched to a missile, and point it at the moon. I also learned about the larger policy process that enabled them to get the mission funding and planning required to pull this off. I want to talk about that in greater detail later, but first I have to share this little anecdote. I went to school at Auburn University. Right down the street from Auburn's main campus is a libertarian political think tank called the Mises Institute. Now, I don't necessarily endorse everything the Mises Institute stands for, but I saw that they were just a short walk away and they were offering free tours, so I figured I'd check the place out. While I was waiting for the tour guide to finish setting everything up, I struck up a conversation with the girl who was working at the front desk. We talked a little bit about my academic interests, and she mentioned how she didn't believe the government's story about the moon landing. I asked her why not, and she said, in a nutshell, that she didn't trust the government, and she thought they made up the whole thing to trick people. She couldn't really elaborate on why the government would do this, but it was enough that she didn't trust them for her to buy into the idea that the Apollo missions were a lie. Now, she seemed like a nice girl, but she was also a little bit confused. Her ability to buy into the idea that the government was able to successfully execute a program that put people on the moon and then tell the truth about it was trumped by her belief that the government is generally bad at the things it sets out to do and tends to lie about them. This is an example of something called motivated ignorance, which comes about when a new piece of information cannot be assimilated into a person's worldview because it conflicts with strongly held pre-existing beliefs. A little while later, I attended a banquet for prospective pre-law students, and I struck up a conversation with a sophomore. He found out about my major and asked me what I thought about the moon landing. He said he wasn't sure whether he could believe that people had ever been to the moon or not. I asked him why this was, and he said he didn't think that the technology of the time made it possible. I tried explaining to him that in fact several new technologies did have to be developed by NASA in order to make the moon landing possible, including radiation shielding and a stronger rocket. He didn't seem convinced, and when I tried explaining the physics of a rocket launch to him, he got confused and quickly changed the subject. The sophomore I was talking to was a political science student. He probably hadn't touched physics in years and knew very little about outer space. At the same time, by staking out a position of skepticism towards the moon landing, he was taking on a position that was counter to the consensus of experts in the astronautical engineering field. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with questioning scientific consensus. In fact, that's how progress is made in science. But not having supplemental facts to back up your position can seriously harm your credibility. In every case, it never hurts to be armed with just a little bit more knowledge, and that's exactly what I hope to help people with by operating this YouTube channel. In this video, I'll be discussing why the US went to the moon in the 1960s, what we gained from the space race, and who the current players are in the new push to go back to the moon, and what we stand to gain from it.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
It's pretty much impossible to understand the space race outside the context of the Cold War. From the end of World War II up to the beginning of the 1990s, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a battle for the role of global hegemon, wrestling over financial and political influence wherever it could be won around the world. Most people are at least a little bit familiar with the global arms race between the two superpowers, during which the USA and USSR ballooned their military budgets as they competed to outspend each other in faster and deadlier weapons of war. Because of the name Cold War, many people erroneously assume that these weapons were only created for deterrence and never actually used. In truth, although American and Soviet forces never directly met each other on the battlefield, the Cold War did encompass a series of proxy conflicts between different groups funded, trained, and armed by the two superpowers. Wars have a habit of accelerating the pace of technological advancement. Pressure to solve a certain problem before the adversary does leads to increased interest and funding for the efforts necessary to pull it off. Once a piece of technology gets created for a military purpose, it usually ends up finding its way to civilian uses as well. As an example, it's very likely that commercial flight would not have emerged in the 1920s without advances in aviation in warplanes in World War I. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles towards the end of the Second World War was the key to unlocking spacecraft technology. The Nazi V-2 rocket program led to the development of the first ever long-range, guided, liquid propellant-powered rockets. The German V-2 rocket accomplished another historical first in June 20th, 1944, when it crossed the Kármán line and became the first ever artificial object to touch outer space. And after the war ended, both the USA and USSR wanted to capture the technology for their own respective purposes. After the Nazi government collapsed at the end of World War II, many of the regime's biggest collaborators were either executed for crimes against humanity or charged at Nuremberg. Not so for the V-2 physicist team, which was actually divvied up. Half of them went to work for the USA under Operation Paperclip, and the other half went to work for the Soviet Union under Operation Asa Vacuum. Although both powers were mainly interested at first in developing these new and ultra-powerful rockets to bolster their arsenals and perpetuate the mutually assured destruction stalemate, it wasn't long before their top scientists and researchers started thinking up other uses for the technology. Mathematical breakthroughs in orbital mechanics opened up exciting new avenues for practical applications of concepts first dreamed up by mathematicians Isaac Newton and Johannes Kepler centuries earlier. Namely, people started taking seriously the idea that a man-made object could be put up into space and held in a self-sustaining orbit around the planet Earth. It wasn't long before theorists and physicists started to speculate that this might actually be practically achievable with further developments in rocket technology. And in 1957, the Soviets pulled it off with Sputnik, the world's first successful satellite. Sputnik was a simple machine. It went up into low Earth orbit, sent a few circulating radio signals, and then fell back to the planet below within just a couple of months. Nevertheless, the Soviets held it as a resounding success. The Americans saw it as an invitation to a challenge. Within just a year, NASA was founded, and it immediately began research into satellite technology. The NASA location I'm at now in Greenbelt, Maryland, was founded in 1959 as an operations and data collection center for weather satellites operated by the US government. Besides the obvious meteorological implications, being able to have accurate satellite data about the weather also had strategic military value. The United States of America could now safeguard its infrastructure from oncoming storms and identify weather vulnerabilities in the Soviet Union and its partners. Other NASA locations helped the CIA develop and operate spy satellites, which could be used to intercept radio communications and capture overhead images of communist military bases. Within just a few years after Sputnik, both the United States and the Soviet Union had a lot more information about each other and themselves. With so much technology floating around in space, it was only a matter of time before people started thinking about putting humans up there too. On this score also, the Russians beat us to the punch. In April 1961, Soviet Air Force pilot Yuri Gagarin successfully made it to space in the Vostok 1 spacecraft and remained in orbit for less than 2 hours. It was a calamitous journey, but it was a successful one. When Gagarin touched down in Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union hailed him as a hero. Newly inaugurated American President John F. Kennedy was irate and demanded to know what could be done to even the score.
Sputnik 2, Vostok, Gagarin. The Soviets have beaten us at every single major space accomplishment. Our program couldn't compete. So we've chosen to focus on a job so difficult, requiring so many technological developments, that the Russians are going to have to start from scratch. As will we.
NASA's Mercury program, which sent 6 Americans into space between 1958 and 1963, went off without a hitch. The Mercury Redstone rocket, which was designed by reformed National Socialist Wernher von Braun and his team in Huntsville, Alabama, was pretty freaking awesome for the purpose it was designed to serve. Unfortunately, it wasn't anywhere near powerful enough to send people to the moon, so NASA had to go back to the drawing board. For most of the mid-60s, Wernher von Braun and co. put their heads together and designed the largest rocket ever made in human history. An epic testament to man's great and terrible ambition. This thing was huge. Standing at a towering 363 feet tall, it dwarfed the Statue of Liberty and cast a cold shadow over any mortal man who dared to stand in its wake. It was designed to fire in 3 stages and pack enough wallop to carry a man to the moon, 500 times further than anyone in human history had ever flown before. The Saturn V rocket was the key to Apollo's success. Unfortunately, messing around with rudimentary experimental rocket technology can sometimes be a treacherous thing, because as Woody says to Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story, "Rockets explode!" During a launch test for the Apollo program's very first mission, a sudden outbreak of fire in the cabin triggered an explosion. 3 crew members died, and the entirety of NASA's operations were hamstrung by congressional investigations, while the Apollo program was put on hold for almost 2 years. This happened in 1967. You may be wondering how the US government could turn things around so quickly that they could get to Apollo 11 and a successful walk on the moon by the summer of 1969. The answer is that a bunch of incredibly smart people had to work incredibly fast. In the fall of 1968, the Apollo program sent a bunch of unmanned flights into orbit. Then they put 3 guys in a capsule and had them orbit around the Earth 163 times. Then, just a couple weeks later, they had a different group of guys fly all the way to the moon, orbit around it a couple times, and fly all the way back. And man, you've really got to feel bad for those guys. Imagine beating the odds on your rocket blowing up, then having to sit in a cramped capsule for a whole 3 days, only to finally get to the moon, pass around it just a couple times, and go all the way back. There's no glory in that. Everyone remembers Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. A lot of people even remember Michael Collins, even though he had to stay on the capsule, which also sucks. But absolutely no one remembers the crew of Apollo 8, even though they technically did beat everyone else to the moon. So what challenges had to be solved during that last year? First, there was the problem of how to house and care for human beings while they lived and worked in space for multiple days at a time. Before the Apollo program, people had only ever been in very short-lived orbital missions. Things like eating, exercising, sleeping, and pooping had never really been an issue during the Sputnik and Mercury programs, but it was a problem that had to be solved before people could make it to the moon.
This is a scale model of the interior of the Apollo 11 capsule. This is hosted on the Smithsonian website. You can see these 3 chairs here. This is where the crew would have sat pretty much the whole entire time. If you look around, you can see a lot of switches. Down below, they had their rations. They had their little toilet in that area towards the bottom. And then there's, of course, the egress hatch underneath the switchboard. Very small space.
With every human-friendly feature that was added to the command module, there also came more mass that the rocket had to lift, and more use of physical space that had to be optimized. The Saturn V rocket could pack a huge punch, but every aspect of the spacecraft had to be optimized to fit in concert with the system. Speaking of systems, the multi-stage rocket apparatus was also an innovation of the Apollo program. Every rocket had to burn for just the right time, and then drop off at precisely the right moment, and then be properly disposed of. The flight trajectory had to be precisely calculated across almost 250,000 miles, and most crucially of all, the command module at the very top of it had to be able to make a safe landing on the moon with enough fuel for the return journey and to reach escape velocity from the moon's surface. Compared to Earth, that may not be much, but there was a very distinct possibility that there wouldn't be enough fuel for the return journey, leaving astronauts stranded on the surface of the moon to face almost certain death. Fortunately, by all metrics, the Apollo 11 mission was a standout success. In some respects, it was even miraculous. I can understand the instinct to skepticism that some people have, just given the impressiveness of the feat. What's maybe even more impressive is that NASA did it again. Not once, not twice, but a total of 6 times over the next 3 years, and no one else died. Even the oxygen explosion of Apollo 13 was handled with an impressive level of cool-headedness, despite the fact that had things gone wrong, it could have brought an end not only to the Apollo program, but to manned space travel altogether. NASA pulled off one of the most dangerous and foolhardy accomplishments in mankind's history with clunky equipment. And they did it over and over and over. And then they stopped. After Apollo 17 in 1972, the whole moon program was unceremoniously shuttered. NASA turned its attention towards efforts closer to home, and the 12 people who looked upon our pale blue marble from the surface of the moon moved on to other things. Some of them became congressmen. Some of them became world travelers and philosophers. And still others were content to live the quiet, simple life with a loving family. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, and America enjoyed a period of being an uncontested world superpower. With no more rivals to face off against, her ambitions became smaller. But some people still dared to dream. After NASA abdicated its position as de facto leader in world missions to the moon, other people started stepping up. Rising stars like India and China began work on their own space programs as they entered the world stage. In 2007, the Chinese Chang'e-1 lunar probe took a detailed scan of the lunar surface and generated a complex 3D map of the entire moon, highlighting certain chemical deposits that could be useful for future study. Future Chang'e missions included the deployment of rovers that collected lunar materials and observations of cosmic events and sent them all back to Earth. Now, notoriously, the Chinese government is typically very standoffish and loath to engage in international cooperation, but their incursions into space seem to be one of the few exceptions they were willing to make. The Chang'e program is still ongoing, and the data it collected has been shared with a whole host of other countries, from Russia to members of NATO to Australia and even the United States. Like many of the other people that I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes, China is hoping to put a man on the moon in the next decade, and the Chang'e program is what they're going to use to do it. In 2008, India launched the Chandrayaan-1 lunar orbiter, which deployed the Moon Impact probe onto the moon's south pole. There, it made an incredible discovery. Lunar craters, which had been ensconced in permanent shadow, in fact concealed pockets of water ice hidden deep in the regolith that covered the moon's dusty surface. After this, the Indian government got to work on Chandrayaan-2, a follow-up mission that would drill into this regolith to learn more about the lunar water underground. Unfortunately, between a bungled contract with Russia, a devastating crash in 2019, and further delays from the COVID-19 pandemic, it took another 15 years before a successful Indian space mission was able to make it back to the moon. This brings us to the next major player in our story. While India successfully snatched the 4th place prize in August of 2023, for those who are still counting, it was only 6 months before a 5th group of humans could claim the moon landing achievement for themselves. And for the first time in history, this group of humans represented not a national government, but instead a private company. That company's name was Intuitive Machines. In 2013, Intuitive Machines was founded by NASA and tech industry alumni who were excited about the lunar water discovery, but frustrated by the glacial pace of progress being made by national governments. They figured that with less red tape and fewer political mishaps, the free market could get the job done better and faster. For the first 5 years of its existence, Intuitive Machines started working on preliminary research and talent scouting, seeking the best and brightest from the public and private sectors to get to work on private space missions. Starting in 2018, NASA began considering them for contracts, with their first official mission being the launch of the Nova-C lander on a SpaceX rocket. Of course, this project wasn't completely immune to unforeseen setbacks, especially in the context of the pandemic. But in February of this year, Anno Domini 2024, The Intuitive Machines Odysseus spacecraft made a beautiful landing on the moon, bringing America back into the lunar space race for the first time in 50 years. The IM-1 program could not have achieved its objectives without a massive collaboration between a whole bunch of different people. First, there were the entrepreneurs and investors who took a chance on the small Houston startup. Then there were the scientists spread all around the world who shared their efforts and data for the sake of advancing pure research. And finally, there were the other corporate partners like KBR and SpaceX who made the project get off the ground. So the question is, where do we go from here? The Trump administration, short-lived and tumultuous though it was, did more to advance the scope of American ambitions in outer space than any presidential administration since Nixon. Between Donald Trump's very first year in office and his final week, his office released 7 ambitious space policy directives, concerning investment in matters such as cybersecurity, nuclear power, and a brand new branch of the military, all centered around outer space. The most ambitious of these directives was Space Policy Directive 1, which declares the following bold mission statement. Beginning with missions beyond low Earth orbit, the United States will lead the return of humans to the moon for long-term exploration and utilization, followed by human missions to Mars and other destinations. With the official support of the President, NASA began work on the Artemis program, which seeks to put Americans back to the moon and establish a permanent research station both on the lunar surface and in cislunar orbit. It also includes a timeline to do the same on the planet Mars. A lot of the work has been contracted out. Northrop Grumman does great work with logistics and the manufacturing of rocket boosters. SpaceX builds powerful rockets that are also reusable, which is something that didn't exist until just a couple years ago. And Boeing is also involved, although maybe they probably shouldn't be. All in all, the point here is that a team is being put together. And even with recent budget cuts to NASA and other political delays, the Trump space directives are still in the books. So it's only a question of when, not if, the Artemis program's objectives become realized. So what's up for grabs in all of this? How about knowledge? As a species, we've learned a lot about gravity in the last 50 years. We have now satellite networks that can connect any 2 people around the globe. We've made huge innovations in energy production and sustainable use. We've developed new methods of agriculture in anticipation of a long-term stay on the moon, which means we can make more resilient crops that can grow in all sorts of extreme conditions. Investing in space is future-proofing humanity. If we wait around until all the oil on Earth is used up to start solving these problems, it'll be too late. We have to take these exciting problems and put them in front of incredibly brilliant people, and the solutions that they'll come up with are bound to have too many applications to count. Now, besides knowledge, what about glory? The drive to pioneer, to explore, to conquer is fundamental to the human psyche. We need challenges to overcome for the sake of our own psychological well-being. Nietzsche called it the will to power, but it's a reality that goes by many names. Life on Earth as we know it in the 21st century can be comfortable but also depressing. Daring to dream of something more on the cusp of the horizon brings us back to the same lineage as Marco Polo, Galileo, and Alexander the Great. In the age of Alexander, the Greek historian Plutarch saw that Alexander was once told by an astronomer friend about the infinite worlds in the cosmos. He started weeping. The people around him were like, "What's up with you, dude?" And he said, "Is it not a matter for tears that when the number of worlds is infinite, I have not conquered one?" As humanity sets its sights on the moon and beyond, we not only fuel our quest for knowledge and glory, but also rekindle the spirit of exploration that drives our species forward, proving that the sky is never the limit. This is Thought Cabin, signing off.